Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and today on The Detail, we're revisiting a topic we covered a few weeks ago: child sexual abuse and exploitation in New Zealand.
I think if people knew how prevalent it was, they would be overwhelmed.
You're frequently confronted by stuff you couldn't even conceive of.
We recently ran a podcast episode about the customs team responsible for catching child sexual abuse material at our borders. But once they find the material, what happens to the offender?
Under the current legislation, a person who is convicted for the offence of possessing objectionable material is imprisonment up to a maximum of 10 years. A person who is convicted for the creation or distribution of objectionable material is punishable by a term of imprisonment up to 14 years.
Up to 10 years for possessing objectionable material, up to 14 for creating or distributing it. And there's no minimum sentence. Sexual violence against children is seen as one of the worst crimes out there, and many feel the consequences just don't reflect the severity. But is a longer jail sentence the solution to this growing crisis, or is there an alternative?
I can understand why people feel that sentencing can seem too light. The harm these crimes cause is profound and it is lasting. But we also have to be honest about what actually keeps children safe. We can't just be looking to sentencing to make ourselves feel better or feel we're keeping the community safe or like we're doing something, because simply locking people up, it doesn't address the underlying drivers of that offending and it doesn't stop it from happening again.
That's Eleanor Parks from ECPAT, a global network dedicated to putting an end to the sexual exploitation of children. We'll hear more from her later. But first, Tim Houston is the manager of the Digital Child Exploitation Team at the Department of Internal Affairs. When someone is caught possessing, distributing or exporting child sexual abuse material, Tim and his team compile all the facts and evidence into a sentencing submission for the prosecution. The process starts with a search warrant.
That's authorised by the courts. We obviously take a number of digital exhibits away. As an example, we conduct a search warrant. We seize a phone as part of that search warrant. That phone goes back to our forensic lab, where it is analysed using specialised digital forensic tools. And the reason why we use those special tools is to ensure that we're not altering the evidence in any way. So we create a forensic copy of what's on that device, and that's done by duly certified and trained staff, and we work from the digital copy. So we're not changing the original evidence on the device where at all possible. From there, we extract the data that's contained on that device, and then we ingest it into specialised software that enables the investigator to review what is contained within that data. That may take the form of the analysis of messaging apps. It might take the form of analysis of the imagery that's present on that device. And it may also extend to other things such as artifacts that have been on the device but perhaps are no longer there. From there, the investigators will be looking for evidence to support their investigation. The obvious one is there any child exploitation material present? Is there any evidence that links our person of interest to the device and to the offending accounts that we are interested in, as well as any other circumstantial evidence or otherwise that's going to help us prove our case.
At the same time, investigators are also on the lookout for material featuring new, unknown victims.
Generally, if material is not already known, it's indicative that there is an unidentified victim at play. And we want to find out, obviously, where that child victim is or who the offender is so we can help identify that child. It's not safe to assume that offenders are only looking at material. We go into all of our investigations with the front of mind thought that there is also a chance that they are physically offending against a child or other types of victimisation, including grooming, etc. So we usually run our victim ID processes concurrently to the location of evidence and extracting evidence to support our case.
That involves analysing hundreds, if not thousands, of images and categorising them based on severity.
We take the findings from that and put it into what's called a summary of facts that is presented to the court as well as the defendant. and their legal counsel. And that sets out the case that, for this example, DIA will bring against that defendant.
When it comes to dealing with offenders, is the focus on stopping them from doing this behaviour, or is it focused on just getting them off the streets and keeping kids safe?
I think it's a balance. Ultimately, that decision lies with the courts based on the information that we've provided. If you look at it like a scale, if you have an offender who is a recidivist offender, they've been caught and successfully prosecuted before, they've been sentenced to prison or otherwise, they are detected again, they've been grooming children online, those types of people are probably more predisposed to a more severe term than a person who's been detected for the first time and doesn't have the aggravating features that the other example has. So those are all, the types of considerations that a sentencing judge will have. But obviously there is a significant focus on victims, and rightly so, and that may be victims that the offender has physically offended against or has been grooming online, as an example, or it's the victimisation of the children that are actually depicted in the material that they've possessed or sent to other people. Does
jail time actually make a difference in rehabilitating these offenders?
Again, there's a sliding scale. So in 20 years of being in this job, we have encountered people where when they've been interviewed, it evokes that kind of hairs on the back of the neck stand up. And we've also encountered people that have been incredibly remorseful, genuinely want to understand the reasons why they've offended and genuinely get help. So it's a situation where we need to approach every investigation with an open mind about who we're dealing with. Certainly, we're in tune to what we would say high-risk offenders who have little regard for being caught and what their actions online or in the real world actually entail in terms of victimisation, but also being in tune to people who may actually stand a good prospect of rehabilitation and integration.
So what does that rehabilitation look like?
Yeah, I believe there are certain restrictions that can be imposed in terms of internet usage and monitoring. So whether a registered person is required to enable a device to be examined, for example, or is only allowed a device for a certain purpose, whether it's work prospects, etc. Any person who's sentenced to a term of imprisonment for the offences in terms of possession, distribution, creation, etc. of objectionable publications that involve children is automatically required to register on the Child Sex Offender Register. So once they are released from the prison system, they will be monitored by corrections and police. People that are not sentenced to a term of imprisonment, it's discretionary in terms of the judge making a decision whether that person is required to register as a child sex offender or not. If they are not, there may be post-release conditions, rehabilitative, counselling, therapeutic services, etc. I'm aware there are in-prison programs. So there's a few pathways that can follow a person's release from prison.
Are these release conditions, are these for life?
It is a specified term, typically, and I'm not aware off the top of my head of any child sex offender registry that were imposed for a person's lifetime.
Right now, there's a bill before Parliament called the Child Sex Offender Government Agency Registration Amendment Bill. It would make some changes to the way the register works.
How it's used, who has access to it, making sure that it is working, make sure that it's still respectful of everybody's rights, including the rights of people who have committed sexual offences. So most of the discussions we tend to focus more on the rights of children and communities. And of course, it all needs to be part of that conversation.
Eleanor Parks is the National Director at ECPAT NZ, a global network working to put an end to the sexual exploitation of children.
Something that's come up a lot lately is who should have access to the register, because there's a very strong push in some places by the public for the public to have access And generally, there's very little evidence to show that the public having access to a register of people who have committed sexual offences makes children safer in any way. It's really important that agencies have access to that information. And at the moment, we're looking at whether NGOs should also increasingly have access to some of that information.
She also says making access universal could prompt individuals to take matters into their own hands when they learn that there's someone in their community who's on the register.
Yeah, it definitely wouldn't be helpful to have these vigilante mobs who feel that they're helping to go and try and take matters into their own hands, even at a less extreme level. When people know who's on that register, and it might be someone who isn't at high risk of reoffending, they're definitely going to be closed out of the community more. They're going to be treated differently. They're not going to be included in things, which is going to make them more isolated. Now, if people are being socially isolated because they're on this list, even if they're on the list as someone who might not be at high risk of reoffence or in-person offending, that's definitely not going to help them when they're trying to get away from what it was that they know is a problem. We want them to have healthy relationships within the community. We don't want them to be driving them into their own house, increasing that isolation, increasing all of the mental health challenges that go along with that, and basically driving them back towards the content that is part of the problem.
It's difficult though, isn't it? Because a lot of people would say, well, why should we be helping these people? People don't want to necessarily interact with these people because they have done horrible crimes.
I can absolutely understand why people want to take that approach. It is, I think, very natural. One of the things we need to ensure is that people who have offended in this way, especially people who are not at high risk of reoffending, we need to make sure they have access to services that are going to continue to support them so they can integrate safely into the community and no one is at risk. Evidence shows that it's the government agencies and it's various NGOs who are providing services might also need access to details about those people. There's really no benefit, even though I can see why people would maybe want to access those lists themselves, but there's really no benefit. It doesn't keep children safer at all. What they are looking at the moment with these reforms is things like if someone who's on that child sex offender registry who is at a higher risk of offending, if they're going to try to travel to another country, for example, we want the right people to be aware of those travel intentions, and we want that to be very closely monitored. There are places where people travel with the explicit intention of sexually abusing children there, because it is easier to access children. Now, if someone who's already on our registry was intending to travel to a country known for that, it could be that the authorities want to keep a closer eye on exactly where that person is, what was their intention for the travel. You can also alert the receiving country so that they can make a decision around whether this person should be allowed into the country. And then the same would happen with people wanting to come to New Zealand.
The Child Sex Offender Registry, as we know it, was established almost a decade ago. It lists all offenders, from severe repeat offenders to first-time convicts. Eleanor says one of the questions officials should be asking is whether this all-inclusive approach is right.
Do you include everybody who has any offence against children? So somebody who has been convicted of accessing child sexual abuse imagery, should they be on there, or should it just be the more extreme, maybe in-person offending, or people who, like we've seen some cases recently where some high-profile people in New Zealand have been accessing quite extreme and violent content and types of child sexual abuse material? Should it just be those people that are on the list? And another question is, how does someone get off the list? And that's really important to consider, because if you are convicted with something and then you've gone through a process of seeking support, you've fully taken accountability for the harm that you've caused, and you're considered at very low risk of reoffending and in-person offending, because they do have ways of trying to measure that. At what point should you be allowed to come off the list, or should you be on that list forevermore?
You mentioned the government is looking at reforms. Are these kinds of things the questions they are asking? Can we expect changes to be happening soon?
It's going through the select committee process, and so we should be seeing some changes. They're looking at that information sharing. They want to expand which agencies can access that information. They're looking at the duration and the review of the registration, as we talked about, overseas travel reporting, looking at improving the monitoring and enforcement. So there's a number of things they're looking at. There's still a question mark for us around to what extent will this be evidence-based and looking holistically at the supports that are needed, the systems that are needed, or will it be taking more of a punitive approach and focusing on increasing punishment for people? Sentencing definitely needs to reflect the gravity of the crime, and in cases where it doesn't seem likely that there is going to be any change in how safe that person is out in the community, then certainly sentencing is part of what needs to be looked at, appropriate sentencing, and applying the appropriate legislation, because sometimes in New Zealand we don't apply the right legislation, and so then the larger sentences aren't even a possibility, like in cases that technically are trafficking cases. If we're not applying the trafficking legislation, then of course we're not going to get the harsher sentences. In terms of the broader conversation around sentencing for child sexual abuse offenders and online child sexual abuse content sharing and things, we also need to look at the broader system. If we want to keep children safer, we can't just be locking people up, and we can't just increase the sentences and lock them up for longer. We need to ensure people are taking responsibility, making sure they're getting the right treatment, making sure they're monitored so they don't reoffend. We really need accountability and strong systems to protect children, not just to focus on sentencing alone.
So how big is this problem? Well, Eleanor says New Zealand's rate of child abuse, that's not sexual abuse per se, but violence towards children, is one of the worst in the OECD. But when it comes to child exploitation, where there's that transactional element, like pictures or videos shared for profit, we have no idea how bad things are.
We don't have statistics on that because it's not being measured. So when the police see cases of child sexual exploitation, they're coded as child abuse or child sexual abuse, or they might come under the PRA, a completely different piece of legislation that was actually meant to be looking at sex work and making sure young people weren't being encouraged into sex work. So we're applying the complete wrong indicators and the complete wrong legislation, which means numbers are really difficult to get. And even conviction numbers don't tell us very much, because most child sexual abuse offending, there is no conviction for it. Most of it isn't even disclosed. So numbers are extremely difficult to get. And that's not just the case in New Zealand, though it is especially bad here, but it's always really difficult to get those accurate numbers.
Eleanor agrees that the systems in place for dealing with cases of child exploitation aren't fit for purpose, but thinks solving the issue starts earlier than court appearances and sentence lengths.
If we're going to look at what the evidence says around this problem, we really need to rewind, and we need to be looking much earlier than just at convictions. I can understand why people feel that sentencing can seem too light. The harm these crimes cause is profound and it is lasting. But we also have to be honest about what actually keeps children safe. We can't just be looking to sentencing to make ourselves feel better or feel we're keeping the community safe or like we're doing something, because simply locking people up, it doesn't address the underlying drivers of that offending, and it doesn't stop it from happening again. If we genuinely want to protect children, we need to invest in full prevention and a rehabilitation system. So that means creating accessible specialist services where people who are at risk of offending can safely seek help before further harm occurs. It means properly funding treatment programs in prisons and in the community that are proven to reduce reoffending, and ensuring when people are released that they're supported and monitored to integrate safely. Many people in these situations, they don't want to be offending in this way. Many people have concerns early on about their sexual preferences, the directions those are going. But if they don't feel safe seeking support in those early days, then they're not going to. They're just going to be led down a really dangerous path where the content that they're searching online might become increasingly dangerous. It might become more extreme, and it might, in some cases, it doesn't always, but it might lead on to real world offending as well.
She says it's not about minimising the severity of this kind of offending, but just that there's more nuance to the issue.
Which is not to say that we don't need accountability, and it's not to say that sentencing shouldn't match the gravity of the crime committed, but it's to say that that alone is not going to keep our children safe. It's not going to solve anything. So yes, by all means, look at sentencing. And Australia, just last week, they announced a new bill.
The coalition proposing a new bill strengthening the legislation around child sex offences. It's calling for a minimum sentence of 5 years for those convicted of the production and transmission of child abuse material.
The heinous crimes that we have seen for years and years that involve the production and transmission of images, internet child sexual abuse, images that are sometimes streamed around the world. This is something that we have to act more strongly on.
But they're doing it within a more holistic approach that also looks at those other things that we've talked about, the prevention, the education, the making sure that people who are concerned about their sexual preferences can seek support. So it's being done, holistically. That's not yet happening in New Zealand. We have people call ECPAT New Zealand, and they're people who are concerned about their own sexual preferences and the content they're starting to look at online. But they don't call and say that. They call and they say that they've accidentally stumbled upon some content online when they were on a mainstream pornography site, and that they're just wanting to report it. And in fact, they're trying to establish to what extent what they're experiencing is normal or really abnormal. They want to know how much trouble they might get in if they try and seek help for it. They might be trying to figure out where they can safely seek help for it. They don't say any of these things when they call us, but that is what a number of our calls are about. And so we have to forward those people on to appropriate services, but in a kind of strategic way, because they've not actually asked for that. And one thing to remember is we're not only talking about selfies, like nude selfies that have been shared beyond their intended audience, although certainly that does come under the same category of child sexual abuse material. But at the more extreme end of the continuum, and what ECPAT New Zealand really works on and needs to see want to see some changes around, is child abuse that is happening in real life to a child sexual abuse, and someone is taking photos of that abuse and videoing that abuse and sharing it online, making money off that, and other people are watching that. In terms of the conversation around sentencing and the types of support people might need and whether rehabilitation is possible, we're really more interested in that extreme end.
So what about individuals on the milder end, those who maybe haven't offended yet but are noticing their interests are crossing the line and want to make a change? What do they do?
It's very difficult for people in that situation to know where they can get help and to feel safe asking for that help. Not to mention our services are really under-resourced in New Zealand, and so that type of support, it does fill up quickly. You've got people who are mandated to receive that kind of support because they have been convicted, but there are a whole lot of people who try and sign up for these programs themselves and find that they're full. And the programs, they really can be quite effective, especially if it is early on. Harm is much more limited, but that person has some concerns about their sexual preferences and they're choosing to seek that support for themselves. They're going to have a much better rate of success in changing their relationship with sex and sexual materials than someone who maybe was told that they have to do that post-court process.
That's all for today. If you're concerned about someone else's or your own behaviour, we've got some links in the show notes where you can seek support. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Thank you to Eleanor Parks and Tim Houston for joining me for this episode. It was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Jeremy Veal. I'm Davina Zimmer. Ka kite.